Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering.
On this episode, we sit down with Julie Beynon, who's the head of analytics at Clearbit, a go-to-market data enrichment company. What's so striking about Julie's role is she's a one-person data team at a 200-person startup. We talk a lot about how to create leverage for data practitioners, some of the projects Julie's tackled to get analytics off the ground and humming, and what it's like doing data at a data product company.
I've had the pleasure of working with Julie for a long time now. Back when I spent all my time as an analytics consultant, Julie was one of my first clients. And in her current role, I've had the opportunity to learn a lot from her. Your role often as a consultant is to help clients apply quote unquote best practices. And I'm not sure that having a one-person data team instead of a 200-person startup is generally considered quote unquote best practice, but it really truly works for Julie's context. And it has really been fascinating watching her create a different way to be a partner to her downstream data consumers. It's really been fun to watch.
Yeah, you definitely had some inside baseball there of oh, wow, you tackled that problem. Oh, that's a lot better than it used to be. But it was fun seeing progress of where she started and where she's headed at Clearbit. It was a fun episode. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Julie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited. I'm finally a guest.
A little backstory. Mm-hmm. You and I believe, originally met in 2017. Is that right?
That's about it, yeah.
2017. You were working at a software startup called Customer.io. And you were, at that point, not somebody who I think would call yourself an analytics engineer, even if that word was a word that was being used. Can you talk just a little bit about what was your career leading up to that point, your title, skill set, what roles did you have before, that kind of stuff?
So definitely would not have described myself in any way as a data engineer or analytics engineer. I had a very much a marketing background. So started in product marketing and a little bit of event marketing, some affiliate marketing, and then became a marketing manager for a Ottawa startup. And I tended not to do very well on the creative side. So the emails and the content, I have a bit of a more blunt way of writing. So there was no pizzazz to it. It really just didn't sit in my skill set. So then I moved into Google Analytics and kind of learned how to do some web analytics, and then moved into kind of operations analytics, but really never did anything technical. No data warehouse, anything, just essentially anything you can do in Excel. Built macros, VBAs, all that kind of stuff, but nothing. You were the first person to teach me how to write a line of C.
So this is really a plan B here, not where your career path was originally taking you.
Yeah, this was fell into it. Loved it. I really liked cleaning data. So I could spend hours working with a data set in Excel, and I would go through every line and make sure it was clean. And that's where I found that I would always prioritize that. And so this sort of fell into that interest of working through the data and modeling the data and essentially creating a data set that works versus, a pre-created data set and reporting on that. I tended to like the earlier stages of data.
Let's stay in 2017. We worked together on a consulting project. Most of our calls were me, you, the CEO, Colin, and his name was Justin, I believe, right? He was the chief revenue officer. Is that right? And so you're this person who is, I don't think you'd been at the organization that long, and you're learning this I think you got kind of dragged into this project, and here's this person coming in from the outside, me being you definitely need to learn to use Mode and Looker and SQL and Redshift and all of this stuff. I'll tell you why I'm going down this track, because I think that the experience that you had in that moment was actually the experience of many, many humans that find their way to data. So I'm interested in how that felt for you. Was that an opportunity? Was that holy shit, I am terrified? What was it like?
I think I hadn't quite figured out where I sit in any organization. And so my motto was just say yes to any task someone gives me, and figure it out on the fly. And either I'll figure it out or I'll fail. And if I fail, then maybe it's not for me. So I thought this was what an opportunity. Someone's going to spend their time teaching me this really cool skill and something I've always wanted to do. And it was in the critical path of like, we needed to get this done and we needed someone to do it. And we have help here. So I was like, yeah, obviously, like I'm going to take this, because how often do you get that type of opportunity where you're essentially paid to learn? So that was my thought process behind it all.
I think you found yourself, you did some mentoring program for a little while recently, right?
Yes.
Is that the type of advice that you give to analysts who are kind of going through this process now?
Always say yes to every task. And everyone always needs a report done somewhere. So if you're interested in something, go and do it. Like just in your current job is the easiest way to grow your data career, because everyone needs a report. Everyone needs data at some capacity. So yeah, that's what I always suggest, is to work where you're at and figure out how to grow into data there.
Zoom to the present. You've been doing this thing now for 5-ish years. I know that all job titles are approximations and they're all wrong in some way. And I know that your job, we'll get into more. Julia has a bunch of questions for you about like how your data team is structured at Clearbit and all of this stuff, because it's very unique. But I'm curious, if you had to give yourself a title, data analyst, analytics engineer, data engineer, like if you had to give yourself one of these titles, is there one that resonates with you? Or how do you think about your identity in this field?
Kind of a funny story how I got my title. So I was originally like the growth operations manager, and I was doing I think I did a call with Claire and Boris, and they asked for my title. And so I said, head of analytics. And I just gave myself that title. Then my boss was like, okay, well, that's what we're going to call you now. I was like, okay, cool. So I guess in a way that was sort of my ideal title. But I think if I were to describe what I actually do at Clearbit, it's sort of like head of GTM analytics engineering. So I don't work on the product that Clearbit as a company produces, that powers our tool. I work on the data that we collect for our performance.
Yeah, I think when Tristan first introduced me to you, he described you as a data team of one. And it was like really kind of surprising and impressive to me, because I just thought like, well, how does one person have so much leverage to be able to be a data team of one in a fast growing startup with Clearbit has like a couple hundred employees at this point? I'd love for you to like set the stage a little bit. Like, what does Clearbit do? How big is the team? How long have you been there? And how is the data org set up?
Yeah, so I joined just shy of 4 years ago, and it was 40 people at the time. And I think you would imagine a data, at that time we were sort of selling APIs to connect data into your tools. So everyone was pretty technical. And the data team was sort of anyone who could write some SQL, they could get a report. And growing kind of where we've grown, it's actually funny. The company as a product has grown as our data org has grown, and we've sort of grown into activating your data. So good data was when I came in, we had to just clean up the data and we had to turn it into something that we could actually use. And there was none of that existed there. And then we sort of moved into self-serving data. So I wanted to be as little of a blocker as possible. So how do you make this data that you collected and put it in a place that people can use and they can just self-serve it, whether it's in a Mode or a Tableau or a Salesforce or wherever. And then where we're at now, and we're still a data team of one, internally, we have, if you look at Clearbit, you'll see we have a ton of data engineers and we have a ton of data professionals, but they working on the product that we sell. So they're not doing any internal reviews or internal performance analytics. And so now we've grown into a team where our goal is to activate the data that we collect. And so too has our product, which I find it's like our data team has grown as a product has grown kind of in lockstep.
And so Clearbit, it's a data product itself. It's an enrichment product where for go-to-market teams, you can get better information about your prospects and your customers, and so that you can do smarter things with your go-to-market motion. Is that a good summary of what Clearbit does?
Yeah, it essentially leverages or activates your data like at every stage of the funnel. So whether it's at the top of the funnel trying to get more leads or trying to, optimize your sales funnel or to engage your customers in any capacity. So it sort of works at any stage that you're interested in using data, the tool can provide that for you.
Got it.
Just as a quick advertisement, we use Clearbit internally, and like our go-to-market funnel just wouldn't work without Clearbit. At every stage of the funnel, we are like doing different things based on information that Clearbit provides, like company size or industry or that kind of stuff.
I love hearing that.
So most of the data team, though, is like in support of the actual product that Clearbit sells. And then there's Julie, who focuses on data that the company needs to better understand their business and operations.
Yeah, that's how we're working right now.
So you mentioned there's like kind of this hierarchy of needs. Like first you have to figure out like how do you get clean data, and then you're focusing on self-serve. Like how long did each of those different needs take to realize? Are you still dealing with the like clean data problem? Likely. Are you still dealing with how do you get self-serve data? Likely. But I'm just curious, like a little bit deeper on what that journey was like, and when you're setting up data function from scratch, where do you spend your time? And then how do you know it's time to go do like the higher leverage thing? You're ready to go to the next phase of that hierarchy of needs.
Yeah. So the first thing I did when I started was I called Tristan and I said, we need to bring someone in to help us. So truthfully, like I started and worked with Claire, and we built out all of the models that were required to give us that information. So really consolidating. When we started, we didn't even have a table of all the users. So there was no way to know every single person in our world because they were in a whole bunch of different places. Account level, funnel metrics, web analytics, like all of that had to be built. And I think to your point, it's still something you have to do. Like I don't think any data person will say their data is perfect in any capacity. So you can always go back and iterate on getting the data ready. And as new data comes in, you have to go back and you have to set that up for success as well. So that's something where we got to a place, and I like to use 80%, and there's no scientific reason behind it, but I was 80% happy and we had enough data to move to the next stage where we could answer 80% of the questions people were asking on a consistent basis. And so I had a lot of stumbles at this stage.
I was going to interrupt you and push you in that direction if you didn't go there naturally. Great.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
Yeah. So I had a lot of stumbles getting the data ready there was definitely some hard pieces with the data, but that's a relatively easy thing to do. Where I find it harder is getting all this data that you can run as work and making it useful. And we definitely tried a lot of mode reporting, and the amount of reports I have sitting in what I call the report graveyard is really embarrassing. Like there's a ton of reports that I spent hours and hours to build and no one's ever used, and put all these dynamic parameters on so that someone could answer any question that they could ever possibly think of. And then what I learned from there is like, we just need to go simple. Like, let's get like the easiest question that everyone can answer. And once everyone can answer that question, let's move to the next stage. And that I would say came in year 2. So I fumbled for about a year of trying to answer these questions and building these complex dashboards and these crazy models, and nothing ever worked because no one could answer the basic question.
So I remember this phase very clearly, and anybody that's worked with me in the capacity of like doing actual data work, you know that I can be like reasonably opinionated about quote unquote what the correct way is to do something. And I think that the wisdom that you had was that you really were incredibly pragmatic. You were focused on your persona that you were serving internally. And you didn't have a lot of like ego invested in, well, Mode is a best-in-class tool to do X and Y and Z, and Salesforce reporting is kind of a tool that gets kicked around as like not a great experience. But like your users were at a certain place and you met them there. Is that a fair way of putting that?
Yeah, we spent all this money on Mode, and I tried to make it work, and it does work in some reporting. So it's not a one size fit all. For every piece of data has to go through Mode, and that's the struggle, and where we finally said, what if we just put the data because if you're serving GTM teams, there's a ton of salespeople involved, right? So let's put the data where the sales teams are comfortable, and then we reduce one barrier to getting the data, which is learning a new tool. Let's just put it where they're at and they can do the reporting. And so one of the first, I would say, the first time I felt truly successful in self-serve was when we got our attribution set up and our demand team was able to answer questions about what's the most successful campaign that we run in terms of pipeline. without ever having to ask me that question. And once that came in, and then even we were able to figure out influence. So maybe it wasn't the thing that ultimately pushed them into our funnel, but they read this blog, they downloaded this ebook prior to being that lead, or being, whatever our kind of attribution. And they were able to get that influence and without ever asking me. And so that's when I was like, we have solved attribution self-serve to a capacity. Like it definitely can be improved, but we're now at a place where I'm not involved in any of that. Nobody asks me, which is great.
I think your definition of self-serve is like really good and different than how other people talk about it, because I think most people, when they talk about self-serve analytics, they mean that they can like help answer questions in their BI layer, or you can like slice and dice your data any way you want and just answer questions. But what I'm hearing from you is a little different. Is like actually self-serve means you can get the data where you need it, and you stop asking the data team to help you with reports, and you just have this extra layer of confidence when you're doing your work because you have that insight with you. So what other destinations have you thought about as being like super important to actually actualize self-serve data?
That's a good question. So one thing I'm trying to make work is combining. So we want to put all of our data where, like, eat our own dog food, so to speak. So I want to put our data that's not currently in our instance of Clearbit, putting it in there so that we can start to get our insights inside of our own tool and understand how to be the best users, the best customers of our own product. And so that's my new goal, is how do I help us learn how to be better with our tool and also get legitimate insights? Because our sales team has good insights. Our marketing team still has to fumble around a little bit in the top of the funnel with Google Analytics, and they're great at it. They're good at it, but I would love to help even more. Like there's a lot of data that they can't access themselves. So getting it into our own tool so we become our, top cost.
And is that like the big project for the next phase of growth on your data journey?
Right now, my current journey is like, how do we grow our total data team? Because we can't stay as one person anymore. And the reason that I think we've stayed at one person is I've struggled with, I'm on this island by myself. And I think I've seen a lot of smaller companies put data on the growth team or the marketing team because that's where the data is. And then they sort of have this person that they can get the data whenever they need it from. So that's where I've seen it start. That's where I've personally started. So it works when you're smaller, but as we start to grow, the problems you see are we have data over here, we have data over here, and everybody wants data in some capacity, and it's not consolidated. So my next real project is consolidating our data across, as a product, the engineering data, our GTM data, our finance data, get it all in one centralized place, because we kind of wild west. We had, we have BigQuery, we have Snowflake, we have Redshift. There's so many different paths to get sort of the same answer. And so that's my big next project. But from a cool project, I would say getting our data inside of Clearbit is another one that I'm focusing on, of how do we make data less of an overhead department.
Got it. Is that a unique problem to Clearbit? Because as I think about it, like you have your production stack that services your product that you sell to your customers, which is a data product. And then you have your internal stack, which you use to help your employees and other coworkers know more about the operations of Clearbit. Do you think other companies that don't sell data products have this like two split worlds that they have to think about more, or is it a unique challenge that Clearbit has because of the product you have to sell?
It's the first time I've experienced it. I'd spoken with a few other data professionals who moved their data team into the engineering and product side and have found the benefits of being that close to all of those technical resources and having access to the engineering budgets for tech, which tend to be a little larger, and have the access to the security. And so I think maybe how many different islands of data we have is unique to Clearbit, but I don't think that every company has a one solid place where they get data. And I think that there is always the issue of consolidating data in one central place and a singular flow of where to get your answers, which we don't have. I mean, I get asked the same question that somebody in another team gets asked 2 days later. So we need to tighten that up for sure.
So as I talk to people in the data industry, like often they'll talk about reporting structures and how that actually impacts the kind of work that the data team can do, the kind of stack that they have, their workflow. And there's this different arguments for like the data team to be more on the go-to-market function versus like the prod engineering side. What are some of the differences of like how does it actually materialize in the kind of work that data teams do, whether they are sitting under like a GTM function or a different part of the organization?
I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I have a dream way that I see it working, yet to be tested in reality. And I think with the advent of analytics engineering, it's become data. If you think of data as a product that you serve to your internal customers, then you really are sort of in the engineering product world. And so by joining that team, you can separate the insights and the analytics engineering and the sort of production of data as a product. You can separate them out. And so then our marketing ops, our rev ops, our analysts can become customers of that data, and they can live in the functions where they understand, what was this campaign about? Why did we run this, et cetera, et cetera. And then they can come to us and ask for feature requests in the form of maybe new models, new fields. So that's the way that I ideally would like to build out the data and separate the insights from the data modeling, and not in a complete different world, like very connected. But if you've put the insight managers on the team where they are giving the insights, then you sort of have that responsibility is there. And then I can work on just the overall data and keep it consistent across the entire org.
Yeah, I think there are some classic examples of how go-to-market teams differ than product and engineering teams, where like often go-to-market teams have to be like nearer term oriented, think about like, how do you just like get the thing done or like realize something in the quarter. And so there's more willingness to just like solve the problems as they come up. Whereas like product and eng teams have to think about like designing things for scale or building the platform or the system. And so I imagine that might also play into how data teams function, but it's really just a guess.
Who are your biggest downstream counterparts? Are they IC marketers or are they like operations people, or are they, you mentioned analysts a second ago. Are there actually embedded insights people onto the go-to-market teams?
Not entirely yet. That's why this is my dream of how to build it out. But right now we have marketing ops and rev ops who function as both insight analysts and operations. So they're using the data to build flows, to, set up all of these kind of marketing campaigns, but they're also doing the reporting in some capacity at the end of it.
And they're primarily using their systems of record, whether it's Salesforce or a marketing automation tool or something like that, to consume the data that you produced.
Yeah. For the most part, they're using all of the data that gets pushed in from Redshift into Salesforce, but they're using that to do all of their work. Yeah.
You, as Clearbit, the company, if Clearbit had to answer a question like, gosh, churn last quarter was 2x what we anticipated, why? If you had, sitting on the sales team, if you had an embedded data analyst, maybe that would be their job. But like, who in your org is answering that question today?
RevOps.
RevOps is answering it. Okay.
Yeah. We've got a RevOps team is growing pretty quickly, and we have 2 new analysts that have just started who are doing a ton of work like that. So they're using mostly Salesforce data to produce that. As
of this recording, this past week has included a lot of conversation in data Twitter about the data analyst. The role that predates the entire modern data stack and has evolved in a million different ways, but you find that like, while we have kind of stopped paying attention to it a little bit because it's not the cool new thing, it's still like this tremendously valuable role in the team. But it's less about the title. It's more about the job to be done. Like somebody at the end of the day needs to be using the data to generate insights about the business. And it could be a RevOps person. It can be the VP of marketing who, I was the VP of marketing who was also like the main data person. It doesn't matter what their title is, but like somebody's got to be doing it at the end of the day.
Yeah. The problem that you face if you don't have a centralized documented place is that you're going to get a lot of people doing it and having different answers. And I think that's the kind of junction that we're at. Is like, there's a ton of people that can do this work now, but we need to have one place, one team, one sort of community where everything, this metric means this data point means this is how we define this. And it's obviously, as a small company, it's changed over time. I think we're at the point now where we're ready to make a solid first documented official pass of everything. This is where you find this data point. This is where you get it. Because it's changed quickly before and it hasn't really changed in the last 6 months, which is nice. We've had a little bit of stability in that function. But yeah, there's analysts, whether it's in their title or not, across Clearbit.
Throughout data stacks, there's been like different approaches here. Like there's obviously the proliferation of data where different teams will have like their silos of maybe they pick their own stack or they pick their own warehouse or they have their own way of doing things. And maybe it works really well or they have consistency within the data they look at, but it's don't go talk to another team because you might get different answers. And I think a lot of people have this like promise of, well, just centralize it, one stack. We also are making a big bet in semantic layer of like being able to help solve this question, but it hasn't ever really been done really well, or like there've been so many iterations of this, like master data management, like control all the copies of your data wherever it sits in your organization. And I'm like curious, just practically speaking, like, do you think that there is going to be like a solve for Clearbit where if you just get this right, you'll have fixed the challenge of getting answers in different teams, getting different answers to the same question?
I think we should do a follow-up to this in 6 months and I'll tell you what my answer will be. I think it will solve some of the most painful pieces, which is internal confusion of where to go for answers, conflicting reports on kind of same metrics. So I think it will solve some of those pieces that have been essentially, I'm doing the same thing as someone else doing. So there's two people spending their time answering the same question. And so by consolidating it into one team, there's one kind of place to ask that question. And then there's one person to delegate it to. But do I think it's going to solve every problem of, this lives here, and answering the question, in a concise way? I'm unsure of the more complicated problems, but we're still dealing with really baseline issues that seem very obvious to solve.
We had, Justin on the podcast, who's the founder of Starburst Data, and Trino has this position where don't move your data, like keep it in wherever it sits. And we are at this distributed query engine where we can sit across all of your data no matter where it sits. Do you think too much consolidation into like one destination is a bad thing, or it's like never enough? Just continue to have one stack that everyone can consume from, and the more consolidation you have, the better.
That's a really good question.
I don't have an answer either. So if you're like, Julia, that's a tough question. That's totally fair.
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of data. And each, Redshift has its pros and there's a lot of cons for it. And so it depends what you're trying to do with the data. I'm not necessarily suggesting we take every piece of data that we have and put into the same place. It's more consolidating the processes, naming convention, logic, so that everything at least follows a similar path. And whether that's we collect it differently, but then we apply DBT so that they all follow a similar naming convention. Because obviously, if something's being put somewhere, it was created 4 years ago, something's now being created now, it's not done the same way. So do we just continue with that, but then have a layer where everything comes in and we follow the same rules, practices, regardless of how the data was collected, and it can be stored, and we don't care where it's stored, but everyone has the similar process. And that's probably where we're going to get in a year from now, like say rules apply to data no matter what. And if it's this type of data, do this. If it's this type of data, do this. But everyone follows that.
This is sounding very data mesh-y, which like if we go down that rabbit hole, then we'll never return from it. One of the things that we've been talking a lot about is pushing data to where your consumers want to use it. One of the things that is challenging about that approach is that it's hard to keep track of who is using what data quality issues exist. Like it, to a certain extent, it might actually make the problem that you're describing right now more challenging, because now you have, I don't know if you still do this, but I remember back in the day, you were a big fan of pushing some data to Google Sheets, because it turns out that there's some things that spreadsheets are really good at. So if you've got some data being pushed to Sheets, some data being pushed to Salesforce, and now you have like another set of things to govern. Is that true, or does that problem actually end up kind of working itself out because the data activation layer just kind of like makes it magically work? For those of you listening, Julie is smiling maniacally.
I think that's why there is a rise in data monitoring tools. And there is a demand for tools that monitor across every stage and get it from your warehouse all the way to your reporting. You know, there's ones that monitor census when that breaks. Because I think the more places that you're pushing it, the more chances that it breaks, the more chances that it's outdated.
Are you using something in that category?
We have not yet chosen something there. No, but
sounds like you're in the middle of considering it at least.
Once we do this sort of consolidation, that it's definitely going to be something that we do, because it is, you make a change to a model and you forget that you're syncing this data via this to this Google Sheet, and all of a sudden the report's out of date. And it isn't until somebody goes to look at it, and it may not actually break it. It's just defined differently because you had to transcribe it differently in the census sync to get it there, right? So it kind of multiplies the problem. And so that's why getting it right at the source means that at least you're not working with a massive problem being multiplied by 2. You're working with like a small problem being multiplied by 2 or 3. So yeah, the more places you send your data, the more third-party tools you're using, the more places it goes, the more room for error, the more room for the metric being defined incorrectly or differently. Yeah, that's just something that I kind of deal with and just accept in some capacity.
Yeah, I think as data goes to more critical places, or people are really depending on it to make a decision, or maybe you're using it for some production use case, or there's some automation built off of the data, the need for monitoring is going to increase. Like if you take the parallels in software engineering, like you don't ship software app without having like sufficient application monitoring on it. But it hasn't been the case in data, because I think the stakes have been lower of like, okay, if my number in my dashboard is like a little bit of out of date, it's okay, because there's like some friction before you actually make some decision that's going to make a huge problem for your business. But as we continue to push data to other systems, create automation off it, make decisions off it, becomes more critical, more production, I think monitoring is just going to become increasingly important and move up on or become more important on the hierarchy stack of needs of your data team.
As data professionals take themselves out of that reporting after the fact and become more involved in top of funnel, middle funnel, like different stages of, I call it the action, because before we're kind of at the end of the retros. We were never involved, or I wasn't personally as involved in the brainstorming and the campaign creation and the product kind of feature creation. I was coming in, 3/4 of the way in. But now that you're part of it, it's more exciting, but you got to get the data right. When something breaks, you're in that call to troubleshoot it, because it could be the data you're sending that's causing the issue. So it's more exciting. You have more impact on the business, but you also have the higher risk, because you need to make sure that 80% is okay for reporting, depending on the report, obviously. If it's a financial report, nobody's going to accept 80%. But 80% is not great in operational analytics. Like you're not going to happily send 80% of the emails correctly, which means 20% are going to be wrong. That's going to get you on Twitter as a company that consistently gets your emails so wrong. So it does require better monitoring, better testing, better QA processes. It requires all of that, because you're involved in more important, and I'm putting important in quotes because it's, you're involved in more real time use of data.
It's a particularly interesting place to be, quote unquote, in the action at Clearbit as a data person, because like you were talking about before, your product is a data product. Do you see at any point whether it's people that have skill sets more like you and less like a classic data engineer being involved in that part of like the actual product facing data? And do you see any bleed over in tooling either?
That's an interesting question. I would say in the last couple of months, the product team is coming to me more for how are you doing this? How could we do this inside of the tool? How can we build this so that you're not building it outside of the tool? So it's just recently become something where we're trying to solve the same problems. So they're trying to solve it for the customer and I'm solving it internally. So how do we build a tool that solves it the way that we want to? So that's kind of further to come information on like how that thing.
But they're not using what we would call analytics engineers to solve this problem. And they're certainly not using DBT in their tool stack to do it. They're like doing it in kind of more traditional data engineering-y type frameworks, right?
Currently, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
That's where my head went too, because like if you're a customer of Clearbit, there's a high level of trust that you're getting the kind of data that's going to help you make decisions for your business. And that's really the value of the Clearbit product among a few other things. But like high data quality is just essential for the Clearbit product. And so I was wondering like what kind of overlaps there would be between data team and the product. One of the things that I've always thought was really interesting about Clearbit in particular is like it's one of the more successful examples of being able to sell a data product. Like everyone says.
There was some blog post about this a couple of years ago where like data products were very hot and then all of a sudden there were several of them that like failed to commercialize appropriately. And all of a sudden it was like, yeah, actually it's tremendously hard to sell data sets in this way.
Well, there are some other really big examples of like $10 billion plus companies that have done it well. But Clearbit, I think, is like a primary example of the poster child of getting the need right for go-to-market teams. Like Tristan said, we use it at every point of our funnel. Like we absolutely rely on the Clearbit data to do our work. And people always say like data is your competitive advantage in a company. And yet, like we don't see a lot of exchange of people enriching, selling like the appropriate data sets or knowing what kind of data you need to help make you more of a data-driven company. And so I've always wondered like why we don't have a marketplace of I have this data and I know others might find it useful and I'm going to sell it, or some kind of more general purpose use case of exchanging of data sets in a really trusted manner. And I'm curious like if others have thoughts on why this is such a hard problem, or if you think it's eventually will be solved.
You trying to give a talk at Snowflake's conference on the share house?
I mean, they're trying. I mean, they think it's a big promise of how do you exchange data sets in a trusted manner where you don't have PII information and you keep like the appropriate privacy controls. But the promise is enormous, but it hasn't been practiced in a real way yet. Or at least I don't think.
My view on this is that data alone is kind of like a commodity. You can swap it in or out. And the reason that it's hard on its own to be successful is we've had data for a while. Like I remember back when I first started, it's like, let's do something with this data. Let's make this data actionable. And so we had a ton of data. We just didn't know how to actually do anything with it. And so the one thing that I appreciate being at Clearbit is they take it that step further. It's like, let's activate this is kind of marketing too, but like activate your ICP, which is essentially like find your best customer and actually do something effective with that. And that's what, we've been growing to do. But I think, with Reveal and Prospector and combining all of those tools of enrichment allowed you to see who was your best customer. Prospector lets you go after more of them, and Reveal lets you know when, this was back in 2017 or 2018 when I joined. Those three products, they worked separately, but together. And now we've moved into a place where it's a platform and it does it all in and of itself. There's no separate products, no separate APIs. And so, I've just never thought of data alone as being very interesting or something. Like the reason that a lot of them don't is they focus on the data quality, which is important, but everyone is going to be 1 or 2% off each other. Like the data itself, depending on your market, your industry, like it's going to be pretty close in the data quality. It's what you do with it. And that's why I've seen other companies fail.
I remember the Clearbit API back in 2016, and it was awesome. But it had to do a lot of work to get that data to a place where you could do something with it. I got paid in like the very early days of Tristan Analytics to actually suck data out of the Clearbit API and load it into Redshift. And now that kind of stuff, it all just flows. It like shows up. You don't have to think about those kinds of things.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you're paying for the product experience.
Yes. Yeah. And I remember early on, we talked about and thought about them as different products. And then somebody once said, like, it doesn't matter if it's the Reveal API or Enrichment, everyone just sees it as Clearbit. And so that's sort of why we've taken this move to consolidate it all into one place. And it's just, this is Clearbit with different features, not different products. And that's been nice to watch the growth and watch the company kind of understand that it's about the experience you're having with the data. And it doesn't matter how you get it or what you get it. It's just, you have to make use of it.
Yeah. I think that's kind of where I've come to too, is like people don't know what to do with their data often. And so it's like you need the workflow around it. And more often than not, you don't even know what to do with your own company data, let alone like a new data set you have to work with. But we're going to wrap up here. This is a question we ask to all our guests, but looking 10 years out, what do you hope will be true for the data industry?
I think I have two thoughts on that one. The first one, just because of my love for marketing, is that data teams continue to be part of the action. So there's different, we're involved in that brainstorming, and data truly becomes a competitive advantage. Right now I see that with our design team. They come in early and they make really impactful changes to the design, which change the conversion rates on our ads and our landing pages. And like, they're really involved. And I want to see the data team be able to make those types of changes where you can measure the difference of having the data team in the room early. And then I would say second, and this is just because, I'm also a consumer. I'm an individual. And so privacy is important to me. And so I would love to see tooling, just make privacy not an issue. Like, it's just so easy to privatize no matter where you're at. And so the data professionals, it's so easy to do it that there's no reason not to, right? Like every step of the way, it's so easy to privatize and secure your data. And then you just know as an individual that it's done. And I think we're getting there, but it does take a little bit of work through data engineers and analytics engineers to privatize that data and really make sure you're doing a good job. And it'd be nice if it was just a click of a button in some capacity.
Julie, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Where can folks get more of you if they liked what they heard?
I'm nowhere.
You're nowhere? No hot takes on Twitter?
No, I'm not. I'm too blunt on Twitter. I'm at maybe another Census DBT chat whenever you want to bring me along. That's
nice.
When I'll be available. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by DBT Labs and is hosted by Tristan Handy and myself, Julia Schottenstein. Have comments, questions, or guest suggestions? Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com. Our producers are Jeff Fox and David Krevitt. If you enjoy the show, please drop a review or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.